Hello, welcome to this Noble Science of Defence training video. I'm Chris and today I've got Sam helping me. In this video we're going to look at the 4 actions. 4 actions in Silver's book are also known as 4 times. It's a reference to Aristotelian physics in which time exists only to measure action. This is something we see often in Silver's book, but also generally in martial arts, time and action are intrinsically linked. Time is irrelevant if my opponent isn't in action. So time and action, very, very much linked. These are not the true or false times. These are 4 completely separate times, but they are to be considered as actions that exist within times, and therefore these actions can be used as times within your fight. So in Silver's book, he describes the 4 actions which we call bent, spent, lying spent, and drawing back. These actions every man fights upon, whether they be skillful or unskillful. He that observes them is safe. He that observes them not is in continual danger of every thrust that is strongly made against him. So what are they and what are they used for? First one, bent. This just means turned, angled, offline. Me and my opponent are stood directly opposite each other. Neither of us is taking an angle. Neither of us has any time nor any action. We could both make a strike, but the problem here is that we would both strike each other. Anyone who knows anything about martial arts knows the first thing you do is move offline. I need to observe my actions and I need to observe my opponent's actions, and these are places when I can take advantage of my opponent or I can be taken advantage of. If we are here, and we're going to do this in far too close a distance at this point, but that's just so that we can demonstrate quite easily here. If my opponent moves offline, as they move offline, I can use this time, because they are in action, they are taking up time, so I can use this time to attack my opponent and gain an advantage. This is why in the wards video I make a ward before or as I turn, because my opponent is aware that taking that time of the bent is going to put them in a disadvantage, and so they close the line as or before they move. My opponent moves offline and I can use this as a time to take advantage. My opponent is aware of that, they close it. Spent. Spent is the end of energy, essentially. It is when the energy of an attack runs out. There are 2 real ways of looking at this. For those who cut very much in a manner like this, spent could potentially be the point at which the attack is no longer a threat to me. My opponent very slowly makes a long arcing cut. It is a threat from this position all the way to this position where it is now past me. So in the manner of threat, this is now spent. However, it still has a lot of energy available to it. Could be that my opponent makes the strike and I move out of the way until it is spent, and then I move back in and strike. However, we don't tend to strike like that. We strike here. If my opponent makes that action, this is where they are spent, at the very point at which their energy stops. So of course, this is a great place to take advantage of my opponent. My opponent makes the attack. I simply step out of the way until it stops moving, and then as it is spent and has no more energy, I can safely move around it. So the way that we take advantage of this is knowing that my opponent is going to be spent. My opponent makes the cut, and I know that I can put my parry in. There's a point at which it will be spent, bang. And the second that my opponent's attack runs out of energy, I can throw energy in. But of course, I have to be aware that I will be spent at some point. I make the attack to my opponent, and here, rather than stopping, I make the cut into a ward, which I am continually putting pressure into. So I am not lacking in energy, but then I know that I'm spent at this point, so this is a great time for my opponent to make their strike. So I simply make myself aware that that's going to happen. One thing I can do is if my opponent parries my attack, is to simply not let the action run out of energy. So if we go slowly, I make my attack, which would normally finish here. As my opponent parries, I simply change the energy that is being put into it, and therefore lessen the time at which the action is spent. There will always be a time when you are spent. You cannot go from one action into another action without stopping. So in this instance, I go here, I feel the energy being put in, and I am still at this point. You see, she presses my sword down. That's because that's the point where I'm spent. For more on this, I recommend, if you can find the book To Stand on a Stone by Anthony Cummins. He makes a really, really good description of this, of action and inaction. Every single action must come to a point of rest before another action begins. So I can absolutely recommend that book to any martial artist anywhere. So there is always going to be a point of inaction. What I want to do here is make that point of inaction as small as possible and make the action that follows it as effective as possible for my next use. So in this instance, I go here. As my opponent goes to parry, I change my action, hoping that my opponent gets spent within their parry, and then I can continue my actions from there. Thus, I take advantage of my opponent being spent, minimizing the amount of time being spent myself. So again, my opponent, rather than simply parrying, will parry and then immediately start taking actions to try and make a counter thrust or counter attack back to me. Or of course, simply to take control of my blade. So this brings us on to lying spent. And that is simply, my action is spent and then I don't move it. So my opponent, because there's no energy in what I'm doing, can simply add energy to it. When I'm stood in my guard, I am lying spent. My opponent can come and put energy into that. One of the things Silver says is continue to be uncertain with your blade. So rather than just standing with the guard and waiting, what I should be doing is constantly moving around and not letting my opponent really see what my blade's doing, where it is at any point. If my opponent is stood in front of me with a guard, brilliant, I know where you are, yoink. Easy. So any guard is lying spent. It has no energy and it's staying still. However, also, if I make the cut and I stay in this position for too long, it gives my opponent the opportunity to then counter-attack that and put energy back into it. Is it particularly dangerous at the end of a strike where my arm might be a little bit more extended than usual, and then of course I'm a much greater lever, and so the amount of time that my opponent can gain from their adding the energy to my arm is greater. Drawing back. Very simply, once I have made a cut out, I must come back to gain the muscular structure to push it out for a strike again. If I thrust, I must come back to be able to thrust again. If I cut, I must come back to be able to cut again. Even if I cut from one side to the other, I cut, draw back, cut, draw back, cut. Whatever happens here, there is a point at which I am drawing back. This is the best one. If my opponent is drawing back, they are taking their weapon away from me, and therefore they are no danger to me whatsoever. If my opponent makes a cut, I parry the cut, and then before she spends too long spent or lying spent, she must draw back. This for me is the perfect time. So again, my opponent attacks, I parry, and then as she draws back, I get the opportunity to follow. So you notice in that last one, Sam was aware that she was in danger when she drew back. So what she did was drew back in a manner that kept her safe. Same again. I parry. I know she's got to draw back, but so does she. So as she draws back with the intention of either warding or parrying my following action. Then, of course, we get into the close fight, which means my opponent cuts. Here, she draws back. She knows that I've got to draw back. I know. And so we end up in this backwards, forwards. We both know we're drawing back. Then what you get is, this is a great place to utilize all of these. My opponent attacks, and we'll just keep it really slow for a minute. She now knows that she is lying spent, but I am also spent. So I am going to make my action to not be spent too soon. She knows she's going to have to draw back, so she lies spent waiting for me to take the action. I take the action, she draws back safely. Now I am spent, and I know that she is likely to take an action because she doesn't want to be spent too long. However, what I might do is at this point, change my angle and strike in. So the opponent cuts, I parry, I draw back, and then change. Because I know that she's going to be spent, so I allow my energy to run out, and then rather than lying spent, immediately change. And again, I change to bent. Opponent moves bent, cuts, I move bent, I parry, she lies spent in the knowledge that she's got to draw back. I am spent, so I go forwards. Then, by changing here, boom, I am now bent again. So I change the position of my hand, which is bending, essentially. All people have this, all people will do this. You will be bent, spent, lying spent, or you will be drawing back. For you to make best advantage of your own, you need to minimize the amount of time between each one. You also need to be aware of which one you are doing so that you can act accordingly. But then also pay attention to what your opponent's doing so that you can fully take advantage of their position when they are in one of these times. So that is the 4 actions and or stroke times, 4 times and or stroke actions, the 4 actions that exist in times, the 4 times that are actions. Unfortunately, they are both actions and times. But study them well, they're really, really important. So get a good hang of those, and again, you'll be able to stop your opponent from manipulating you and be able to manipulate them much more easily. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in class.